If you're anything like me, you like to use 3D sculpting or 3D modeling to concept things out, to develop an idea, and get it, about 70% of the way there using polygons. I like to integrate that with sketching and overpainting and stuff like that, and that's how I got to something like this. I did a little overpainting on this, not much, but this is my sculpt. I rendered it out in Keyshot at the time, and it was just this guy in a T-pose, and although aesthetically pleasing, it's not all that emotionally engaging yet, mainly because it just lacks context. And he doesn't have a pose, he's not doing anything, he's not carrying anything, he's not interacting with anything. And so at this point, you kind of want, at least I do, and somebody might even ask you, okay, can we see this guy in a pose? Can we breathe some life into him, make him look like he's alive and not just a suit of armor or something? And that's where you have to decide, okay, how are we going to get him into a pose, right? Well, we can sculpt him into a pose. What if this guy didn't have any low poly geometry, associated with him? He didn't have a cage or anything. He was just all polygons. So even if you did have a low poly cage, you'd have to sculpt him into a pose, using ZBrush's tools, whatever you like to use for that. Z-spheres work, but they don't work well with a lot of polygons. And you can also use the transpose tool, using the masking and the rotation, tool involved with that. You can get them into a pose, you can do that in ZBrush. But what if we wanted multiple poses? What if you wanted to change the pose in any way, shape, or form? Well, you'd have to sculpt it in. Um, I think the best way to handle that is to actually create a low poly version. Retopo your mesh in some way, so that it's animation friendly. And so what I do is there's a lot of ways to retopo a mesh, but what I like to use is ZRemesher in the latest incarnation inside of ZBrush. So ZRemesher is right here, right in front of me, and that'll just create a low poly cage. Let me show you what that looks like inside of Maya. So this is the final cage that I wound up with. It's it's not perfect, and I had to. ZRemesher doesn't handle fingers too well, so I had to kind of model those in myself. But it'll give you a really great start. And this is by no means a final mesh for like a game engine or anything like that. We're still in the concepting stage. We're just kind of like at the end of the concepting stage. That's the point that I want to come across here. You kind of want to see how he's going to look before you put a ton of time optimizing your character. For example, I just brought in this weapon just so I could, have it in my concept illustration. But all I did was I used the decimation master. And no UVs involved here. I don't think I really need it. But I did need it for this guy, mainly because he's got all these complex shapes, that it's wrapping around the body. And what you're seeing here is just the color map applied. And that's what you see here in ZBrush as well. These are just polygons. So polypaint lets you paint color directly on the vertices. There's no UVs involved with that. And if you've used ZBrush, for some time, I'm sure you know that. But for those who don't, that's what ZBrush offers: the ability to sculpt and kind of paint in where you think you want your colors to go. and you can render this like I did in the T-pose and get a pretty good idea of, you know, your aesthetics. But if you want to get something that's emotionally more engaging, that's what I'm going to go over now. And that's where Substance Designer comes in. After you Z-remesh your figure, your character, your prop, whatever, you can take your high poly mesh and reproject it onto your low poly cage, and then extract normals, your normal map from that. So that's what this one looks like. This is the torso of the character. I used UV Master instead of ZBrush to just quickly unwrap. You know, it didn't take much effort. You know, if this was designed for something a little more involved, like a game engine, where everything needs to be perfect, you know, I would go in and consolidate a lot of this. But that's not what I'm doing here. I'm not making a final mesh. I'm still concepting. So I was able to take these normals and create curvature, and the curvature node inside of Substance Designer here, and kind of highlight where the edges would be. Gives a nice, you know, detail anywhere there's a hard edge inside of the normal map. It'll make it a little bit brighter or darker. It even makes the recesses a little bit darker. Some people call this a cavity map also. So I find it's kind of doing cavity and highlighting. So that's what I call it inside of my mind. And then you can take your, you can also create an ambient occlusion. It's not ambient occlusion based upon, you know, where the arms are compared to the rib cage or anything like that. It's just creating form over the normals. And there's certain settings you gotta, you know, get right in order to get this kind of look. But I'm multiplying that on top of the curvature and the color. So I got an overlay of curvature on top of color, and then I have color and curvature being multiplied with this ambient occlusion node, and that's being plugged into the final diffuse output, which looks like this. And I'm pretty happy with these kind of details. I won't know for sure, you know, if this will work until I see it in my final render, which is going to be V-Ray in this case. But you know, it gets me about 70-80% of the way there, which is enough. You know, I don't want to bring in my mesh into this program and, you know, do a bunch of work only to have it not look, you know, very close to my V-Ray render. You know, I don't want to go through all that. But I do want to get about 70-80% of the way there. You know, so as you can see, I can take the normal map and really extract a lot of information out of just the normal map and create detail based upon it. And I'm not using, you know, world space maps or object space maps. I'm just using the normal map and some color that I painted earlier inside of ZBrush. And for my final material, you know, I created a specular and a glossiness map just to get me in the ballpark of how it might look. But that really depends upon your lights. You can select this little light tool, and you can kind of move it around to get a feel for it. Mainly what I was going for, I was not only looking for highlights of color around the edges, but I also wanted to make the specular a little more glossy around the edges. Go back to the camera tool, and you can see that these highlights are happening mostly on the edges, and you can see that in the specular and glossiness maps that I made. You know, it's a little bit brighter around all the edges that I created. And to me it looks more visually interesting and a little bit more believable than just applying an equal amount of specular across the whole thing. Because I would have to paint that in. I mean, if I was doing this the way I would do it, you know, without UV maps, I would just bring in a high poly model and then I'd have to render it out and then paint this stuff in by hand. But here I don't have to do that at all, which is awesome. And it didn't, and like I said, it didn't take a lot of time to create these UVs. You know, if you went through the trouble of sculpting things like I like to do to fully realize your vision, then you don't have to do a lot of hand editing in the end, because that's super time consuming compared to this. And there's the glossiest map. Kind of same kind of story, it's just slightly brighter. I created two different hierarchies for the specular and glossiness, but they're relatively the same kind of deal. And I was, you know, applying a different curvature node, you know, that has a lot more intensity than the color one. But in a nutshell, that's, you know, what I wanted to show. So later on, I'm going to be showing how I take these maps and, you know, apply them all to this mesh, so it just doesn't look like flat polygons with flat color, but a lot of detail will show up.